So I offered to introduce Brian because I've been following him for a long time on Twitter. He's the author of a book on social media. He's a very prominent blogger, well-regarded Twitter, and I give you Brian Solis.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I owe you one. Drinks are on me. In the blogger lounge. All right, hey, well, thanks everybody for being here. I'm actually really excited to be part of this conference as well. I'm not sure, how many people here are familiar with the Conversation Prism? All right, wow. I was kind of looking at the session agenda and I thought, you know what, we probably should have promoted that some other way because I'm not quite sure that everybody was familiar with the Conversation Prism, even though they should be. So let me just quickly explain what the Conversation Prism is about, and then we'll jump in. I am the kind of guy who loves people to interrupt me as I'm speaking. So if you have questions or you want to know anything, if you think something needs clarification, just please shout it out. And if there's insults too, just put it on Twitter, and I'll read them later. All right. Well, the Conversation Prism is basically this. It's a map of the social media landscape, and I'll get to it. And the reason why I spent a year mapping the social media landscape is because whenever you talk to any brand or any marketing professional or PR agent, they basically will tell you the same things. You know, we got to get a Facebook fan page, and you need to get on Twitter, and you need to set up a blog. And the truth is that social media is much larger than those three networks. It's far more extensive than you could even imagine. It's far more extensive than I could even chart. There are too many networks to even get into one map. But the point of it is that when you use the Conversation Prism not just to see all of the social networks out there, but to use it as a search and listening tool, because each one of those networks has a search box, basically, you can create a map that would then tell you specifically where your brand should be participating, where your brand should be engaging. And we'll go through all of that, but basically the thing that came up in a lot of my research that, you know, things like Google and Yahoo Groups, which is very Web 1.0, was pervasive and not, you know, more conversations there than there were on Twitter, believe it or not. So since Carlos is here from Cisco, I'll have to acknowledge that I borrowed this from Cisco. Cisco uses a term called the human network, and that's what I believe that social media is really about. I think what we'll see here in the Conversation Prism and some of the work that I've done and field work in terms of listening to conversations across the social web, I don't like to look at things as any one network. You know, what's your Facebook strategy? What's your Twitter strategy? Well, what's your human network strategy, basically? Because people are interconnected across multiple networks. So, before we even get started, if your company doesn't even have guidelines about the use of social media, even if you don't have a social media strategy in place, that needs to happen ASAP. There are far too many instances and examples of employees tweeting company secrets in meetings, leaking confidential information unintentionally because they don't know any better. And so those guidelines need to exist, if for nothing else than just to kind of make people aware that they are more powerful and influential than they think. So let's start here. Attention is now a precious commodity and also a very loud mic. I guess I have your attention now, though. Basically, what that means is that the attention dashboard, every single person in this room at some point in time during the day will have their attention focused on something. And that something could be TweetDeck, People Browser, Facebook, something where all of the conversations are flowing in here in real time. And the reason why I call this an attention dashboard is because this is where most people are finding information, discovering new information, what's news, what's hot, what are the links to click through, what should they be interested in. It's also where they can see the reactions to their updates, their tweets, their blog posts, the things that they're sharing online. It all happens in real time. So if we want to get onto that attention dashboard, we have to figure out what it is that compels them. So this is why I talk a lot about sociology in terms of social media. Because sociology is the study of human behavior, the culture of communities, what moves people to do certain things, what governs their interaction. Social media is just a series of tubes and networks that connect us in new ways. It's not necessarily an art or a strategy in of itself. It's just a framework. It's the human nature that we can use to sort of tap into that social, into the social web. So it all starts with listening and observation, and this is where I think we can start to see the separation between theorists and experts, the true experts. Because if you don't necessarily understand exactly what's transpiring in the social web, what's being said, where it's being said, what that sentiment is, what's the frequency and volume, what's the extent, then all you're really doing is just participating in the chatter, right? I mean, every single social media example that we see, you know, on Mashable, for example, these companies are lauded because they're on Twitter and because they're at replying everybody, or that they're giving discounts for airfares, or what have you. But I've got to believe that there's more value and promise to social media than just using it as another network for sharing coupons, or just validating people, hey, at so-and-so, thanks for that tweet. Yep, we're the best company ever. There's got to be a lot more value, I believe. I also believe that the conversation is bigger than Twitter. Yet, I don't know, it depends on what conference you go to. You would swear that Twitter was the only social network in the world. Well, that and Facebook. But, you know, Twitter claims to have 25 to 30 million users. Of those users, the real number of people that actually tweet more than once is only 5 to 6 million. It's a really small number, yet it is, in our minds, the biggest and most pervasive social network out there that's defining the future of all of this stuff. Facebook has 250 million users. Facebook has something like 10 million videos uploaded a day in the network. It's really active, and it's only one of the networks where we need to participate, or at least listen. So this is the Conversation Prism. For all of those who haven't seen it yet, it's very pretty. And if you go to theconversationprism.com, you could download free versions of it at any size, so that way you can print it out or what have you and just kind of experiment. I introduced this, as I said, not just to map the landscape, but to give you a tool to go out and specifically find out where those conversations are that matter to your business, that matter not just to your business, but to your marketplace. What are people talking about? How many times are they talking about you? What are they saying about your competitors? How does that share of voice look in terms of all of these searches? The reason why doing it manually, yes, it sucks because it takes a lot of time, but the reason why doing it manually is more helpful to you, at least if you do it once, is because tools like Radiant 6 or Symphony, or you name your service, they don't have access to every single social network out there. A lot of these are walled gardens. They don't allow for their networks to be searched by third-party tools. Twitter, yes. Blogs, sure. But Facebook, you can't, at least not yet. You have to do a search specifically within Facebook, or FriendFeed does have access to Facebook, but yes.
The first time I saw the Prisma, I was like impressed. Who did that? Like, so it's a genius. I want to know, how did you start it, like, in the colors? How was your concept when you started out?
Okay, so the name, the Conversation Prism, because you'll notice it's not necessarily a refraction of light. It started as that. And as the networks became more prominent in terms of which social networks were important to track for these conversations, I realized that a refraction of light just wasn't going to, it was going to lose itself as it started to expand. So the colors became less important if for nothing else, it just helped the networks stand out a little bit. But there's a method to the madness and how they're divided. You know, you have everything from blog platforms to collaboration, crowdsource, reputation, and everything's very. There's intent behind the placement of each logo. The other question I got is, does the logo placement closer to the center or to the end means that was paid for or sponsored or advertised, or if I showed favoritism? And then I realized that that could have been a business model for it and funded the research. But no, the next version of this prism is actually even more extensive, but further qualified and refined, because networks will merge or mash up or disappear just because that's just the nature of the web. But everything is representative of where those conversations are taking place. In fact, when I go through, for every company I work with, I do manual searches over a 30 or 60-day period to just see what comes back. And we'll go through some of the search criteria in a little bit. But I create a specific version of this Conversation Prism, or what I call a social map, specifically for that company based on the research and the feedback and the data that I get. So that way, it starts to maybe look like only 5 or 6 networks for the company. Right, I read this article, I don't know which publication it was, that said the 50 networks your brand needs to be on if you want to survive. And I said, whoa, that's irresponsible. I think if you're participating in 50 networks, you're not going to survive because you're going to go broke trying to pay people to stay on, participate in all those networks. There really aren't that many networks. People feel overwhelmed when, they say, how are we going to scale? How are we going to participate in all the networks where, that are in this Conversation Prism? But the truth is that it just gives you a place to start. And the most overwhelming part of any of this is just starting, right? And that is just searching. It took me, a week of a few hours a day to search, particular companies on a 30 or 60-day period. It takes you longer if the company's a lot larger because the results are pretty huge. But I even mapped out sort of how this whole process should work for you, and we'll go through that more specifically. But for those who need to see it a little bit more blown up, I broke it out for you guys. I didn't put the center there. But here's some of the free tools that I want to talk about of where to search. So you can use a search box, and you can use a lot of these other tools as well. For example, Collecta is a new real-time search engine that, when I say that the conversation is bigger than Twitter, Collecta will prove it. How many people have used Twitter search in this room? Okay, so nobody. All right. Collecta is like Twitter search, but for the entire web. So if somebody sends a tweet, it'll update. Let me see if I have a screenshot of that somewhere. Yeah, here's a screenshot of Collecta. And this was something I snapped this morning on my way into the summit. But basically, you could see that it grabs tweets as they're published. It grabbed Flickr images as they were published, all with the same keyword. If there were dig stories, if there were blog posts, it would all appear in real time, just like Twitter search. So it just keeps pushing the older ones down. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important if your brand is active in the social web, or if your customers or influencers are active in the social web, because the things that they're saying obviously are happening not just inside, but also outside of Twitter. And you need a tool in order to be able to document that real-time activity. And this is that tool. This is the first real promising solution that I've found where I can find conversations outside of Twitter that are important as well. All right, so let's go back and I'll show you a few neat things here. All right, the other one is people browsers. How many people are familiar with people browser? All right, that's a good number. It should be everybody in this room. Everybody familiar with TweetDeck? Okay, think TweetDeck, but for the entire social web. You could have a dashboard, and I'll go back to it. You could have a dashboard for every social network. So you could have Facebook, Flickr, YouTube, Dig, Twitter, the blogosphere. You can have an unlimited number of stacks. Hopefully you have a big monitor, or a bunch of them. But the point is that if you truly want to see what's transpiring out there, you have to look at where the conversations are taking place. And sometimes the conversations in Twitter are not as significant as we think they are. They just are there, and therefore we feel compelled or driven to maybe respond or document them. A lot of companies that I work with simply watch Twitter all day long, keep reports for sentiment, volume, they share them with executives, and then do nothing with them. And there's no point in that. Honestly, if you think about, well, what was the potential of those conversations? Were those conversations requiring responses? And what about the conversations that were taking place in the blogosphere? What about those comments? If you search Backtype, I don't know if you guys have ever used Backtype, but Backtype is a search engine for blog comments specifically. The results will blow you away, especially if you have a very visible or public company. Sometimes the most prominent and prolific conversations are happening within the blog comments because, according to the laws of social media, tell me or stop me if you've heard this one before, 90% of the people within a specific social network read and consume. 9% will publish and share, and 1% are your active users. It's called the 99-1 rule, right? And if you look at Technographics, which is Forrester's version of that 99-1 rule, they take the entire social web, and still the numbers are a little bit lower in terms of consumers, but it's still the same thing. And that 9% are people like blog comments. These are things that you would never have seen in Twitter. These are things that you'd never have seen in a blog post per se, but will show up in blog comments. And if you have a blog like, let's say, TechCrunch, that has over 1 million views, that's a lot of people who are going to see that comment, more people than maybe the few hundred that might have seen a particular tweet. Yet companies are dedicating resources and teams for monitoring Twitter and not the blogosphere. And I believe that that's why that's why we created the Conversation Prism, was to help people realize that if you want to be effective in social media, then you have to be in many places, not just Twitter. And we'll just fast forward here. So do remember these tools, and I'll send a copy of this presentation to anybody who wants it. But People Browser is by far the most effective tool for monitoring conversations, and it's free for now. And you can get, and I'll show you some sample reports, you can generate search reports based on your keywords and with integrated sentiment. I also asked them to integrate the ability to add comments to these tweets so that when you're creating a report for management, you just have one place of which you can share all these things right now. The other thing is back tweets. I would highly suggest that you use, especially if you're sharing or trying to get an assessment of traffic to a particular link or a story. As you know, many people use Bitly, some people use tinyURL, and there, up until back tweets, there wasn't any way to find all of the conversations related to a particular link because of all of these disparate URL services. Well, Backtweet can take any link and figure out which services truncated a link to that particular URL and get you a stat on the conversations around that link. So when we published the Conversation Prism, I realized that there needed to be a back-end discussion as to its significance. And there was a post, if you feel like, I don't know, reading a few thousand words, called the Conversation Index. And it takes basically the Conversation Prism almost like an instruction manual, if you will, and it tells you exactly what to look for and how to document what you're looking for in order to present it to the teams that can make decisions based on your research, right? And some of the things that we look for, let's just take a 30-day period, right? I would suggest that you look up a keyword related to your brand or a product, as well as your top competitor or competitive product for the same 30-day period across all of those networks, and document it this way. Get a spreadsheet, something fancy, and document you versus the company for volume, frequency, reach, sentiment. Let me explain these. So volume, right? How often is that keyword coming up, right? Well, volume, frequency, and reach are this. How many times is that keyword appearing in that time period? You can do it by day or by the 30 or 60-day period. What was the reach, right? A lot of people will look at Twitter and they will say, okay, the potential reach of that tweet was the number of followers of that particular person and the number of followers of anyone who retweeted it. But if you're looking at sort of reach within the blogosphere, well, there's readers of the blog, there's RSS subscribers, there's traffic to that particular blog. Other social networks, will have their respective social graphs, so you can kind of get an idea of the extent of the visibility or the potential impressions of that keyword within each social network. The other thing is that I manually document sentiment. Even though there are tools out there that automate sentiment, I do it manually, especially if it's only a 30 or 60-day research project, because sentiment analysis is really flawed. There's some fantastic instances where an algorithm can't figure out if it's negative or positive. And it doesn't matter, because what you learn by finding negative commentary tells you everything you need to know to design a much more effective social media participation strategy, because you have unless you're not human, you can't help but to engender some empathy. You can't help but to feel a little bit of the pain of what you're researching and what you're finding. Yes?
Does that mean that you have to read every comment yourself?
I do.
So in other words, that's how you document it.
Mm-hmm. I do, absolutely, and I flag the ones that are more critical or more interesting or more informational, because we've been able to create new processes, governances, and even new products and services based on that feedback that we find that would have been totally missed otherwise. And if for nothing else, right? I mean, why are we participating in the conversation? You know, is it to steer people into the positive camp, or is it to adapt and build a more, you know, consumer-friendly or public-facing organization that people can really build relationships with? And so that it's that process of sentiment that I think that we miss out on in terms of automating it, if we're at least doing it periodically, right? So one of the companies that I'm working with, you know, manual can be expensive, depends on the labor that you employ. So one of the companies that I'm working with, we just do it on a quarterly basis, but my gosh, I mean, the things that we come up with are always astonishing. They always just inspire some amazing, amazing programs moving forward. A lot of the other things that we can measure and document are things like perception. Probably most importantly, and this is the thing that executives always respond to very well, is the share of voice, right? How many times was your company or keyword mentioned within each social network in comparison to your competition? If nothing else, at the end of this process, you have what we call the conversation index, which is a benchmark for a time period, right? So if you were to research over time, even if you used automated tools, you know, moving forward, you have something of which to compare it against. And usually these programs moving forward are going to be a little bit more informed, a little bit more probably effective, and you should see those numbers always trend in your favor, right? The other thing that we document, and this is actually, I think, a trend that you guys are going to hear a lot about here in the next year, is the idea about establishing response candidacy and ownership. There's light conversations about social CRM right now, right? And the reason why I say light is because if you looked at the world of CRM, it's much more than just responding and managing those responses. But in the light world, right, we're seeing some of this with Twitter right now. If there's a problem, Comcast has showed that you can go out there and address it and usually fix it in the public spotlight. Dell has shown this. But if you look at the consumer index for Dell, they're still really low on the totem pole in terms of satisfaction. You know, is Twitter changing that? Well, maybe, if you can consider one tweet at a time in terms of how many millions of customers they have. But the point is this, is that they're starting to establish an infrastructure that is outward facing, right? It's extrospective versus introspective. And the more you do that, probably the more human your company is going to become, probably the more, you know, I joke with Frank Eliason, who runs the at Comcast Cares Twitter account. And I said, hey, so at what point are you guys going to fix the things that suck? You know, because you could spend all day long fixing these problems one by one, but if you don't fix it internally, if you don't have the process to support those transformations internally, then you're just going to go bankrupt trying, you know, because it started with just him, and I think within the first 2 weeks, it went up to 10 people trying to support him just from the volume of negative discussions. So basically, the point is this, is that most companies that are even engaging right now in terms of listening to the social web are limiting it to only Twitter, and they're not responding, right? And then those that are responding are just chatting. They're not necessarily being much more strategic, and there's only a very few amounts of companies that are doing these the right way, right? Like H&R Block is helping people answer their tax questions. Wells Fargo is helping people with their finances. You have Koji beef that's helping people buy Korean tacos. But there are certain examples where people are being very helpful to their audiences, but most aren't. And I believe that in the next year, we're going to see companies establish the infrastructures that are going to shift from a monitoring or a listening program to one of participation. And it has to have a CRM-like infrastructure to be able to support it. Who's responding to that tweet? What's the status of that blog comment or that blog post? And then also, who is going to take that activity and document what trends are happening? What can we ideate based on these trends? How can we adapt? How can we participate through this form of what we'll call unmarketing or service? So a lot of companies that I work with that are seeing the advantages and the benefits of embracing these responses or these negative discussions and trying to get, or at least help or steer people to the information that they need. One company in particular makes every single employee, from executives to interns, man the customer service phones and email for a day or a week. And that's because it teaches them how to feel the pain of the people that they're trying to connect with. And in order to feel that pain, you have to feel that pain. There's no way around that. And you can try to bullshit your way through it, but it's not going to work unless you help people and genuinely help them. And that's the only way that I believe you can be sincere and genuine as you're responding. But I believe that that's where most companies are going to go over the next year, right? And so this is a very crude example of what that social map looks like after the research that you perform, but basically says, you know, these are the networks that we determine were active around our brand or our competitor's brand. Now, this is a project that I did for a company that has to go unnamed, but this is really important because I believe that in the next year or two, this is what I call the human network, and I believe that this is where companies are going to really start to see the light. This is a list, a linked map that's living and breathing of everybody who is of influence to a particular company, who has talked about the market, who influences about the market, or influences the market, or talks about the competition quite often, and how they link together in terms of relationships. And those relationships are through link backs or tweets or mentions of other people. So all of these people are actually influential. They're not people who just mentioned a keyword. Many of them are bloggers. Many of them are people on Twitter with thousands of followers or hundreds of followers that are very active and influential in their own right. But the point is this, is that you can click and see who they are and what that relationship is to the other person. So when you're trying to figure out who you should be engaging with in the social web, it's not about any one network strategy anymore. Now it's a human strategy, because these are the real people who are actively influencing your market, not one tweet at a time, but through several, and through several posts, through comments, through digs, through YouTube videos.
Platform you use to create that?
This one is a proprietary one, but you can get something like it from a company called Mailana. It's Mailana. And it's a brilliant platform. This is the Mailana platform. This next one I'm going to show you is the same map, but through a company called Linkfluence. And we had them build custom platforms for us so that we could create this human network, because nobody's really thinking about things this way yet, right? The way that Mailana works right now is to build this map for everybody that you're linked to in Twitter right now. So you get a visual representation of what you already know. But all of these names and people came through from the work that we did in the Conversation Prism, just a very manual search, and we were able to find the people that were connecting to each other. All right, this is Linkfluence. Now, this is just one click that we had found that this particular person at Bloomberg was highly influential in this market. And when you click them, you can see all of the people that they link out to in terms of this human relationship map, and all of the people that are linking into them. And yes, this looks overcomplicated and probably more than you need to do in terms of how you're going to engage out there in the social web. But the point is this, is that we have to start looking at the people who are influencing your marketplace, not just the people within certain networks, right? And I say that because almost every company I know is only watching Twitter and maybe the blogosphere. And a lot of that has to do with internal politics, or maybe not just knowing. But here's a people browser example. This is a free tool, by the way. You can plug in, I just use JetBlue because it seems to be an East Coast favorite. If we were in San Francisco, I would have plugged in Virgin America. But it gives you a sentiment report in real time about, let's just say, hypothetically, whatever it's channeling. And this, I didn't have enough time, so I just channeled Twitter. But it gives you a real-time sentiment analysis of what are the keywords associated with your primary search keyword, and then what's that sentiment distribution look like? You know, look how many conversations are neutral, right? I bet you if you did a manual search on that, much of this would bucket into the positive or negative categories. But the point is that you can get this kind of information right now for free, but wait, there's more. You can get sentiment over time, how it's changed based on trends or topics. And then it'll also give you, and this is a long list, I just couldn't squeeze it all into one slide, but it'll give you basically a real-time report of those tweets that are contributing to the report and where they sit, you know, neutral, positive, negative. And then this is the thing that I had asked him to add, which is this add note category. So you could click on this and say, you know, this is really interesting. Who is this here? I can't read it over there. But Iceberg loves the service. We got to make sure to send him a thanks publicly or what have you. And then you can just publish this as a report into a Word document or what have you, and give to the executive team so that they can see some real data as it relates to the social network data. Now, this is not unlike the stuff that we're doing manually as well, but it's just more representative of multiple social networks. Right, and so this always brings up a very interesting discussion. Well, who owns social media within the company? And the truth is that I don't know that there's one simple answer to this. I could tell you that everybody thinks that they own social media within the company, and there's always arguments between public relations and marketing, and even down to the product groups. And everybody's creating this like social anarchy where they're setting up Twitter accounts and they're blogging over here, and these people are uploading all these insane videos up on the corporate YouTube channel, and it's just chaos. There's no structured pattern or branding or intelligence or just strategy behind the whole concept. So, I guess the easy answer to this is someone needs to own social media, and it needs to be a very neutral role. In some of the discussions that I'm having with bigger brands, we're looking at the idea, don't laugh, but of creating somebody that would be sort of like a chief social officer, somebody who would take responsibility for defining the governance of social media across all of the divisions, and then pointing ahead of social media for each specific division that would report into this chief social officer. And the reason why we're doing that is because if you look at most examples, companies are just shaking their heads because they're just moving and reacting. A lot of this is ad hoc, done with very little planning, with very little intentions. They're just jumping on because they feel like they're supposed to. But the point is that if you can't reel it back in, you can't necessarily control that perception that gets outside. And I have some answers for that, right? Because here's a very graphical view of all of the people within your organization that are competing against each other to try to bring social content out there. And you have, let's just say your divisions on this side, you have the people that they're reaching, and then you have the people that they look to for reference or credibility or justification or vindication, basically to benchmark these ideas of what they're hearing. But you have all these different things that are starting to socialize that are really just competing against each other and working against each other, getting out there in the social web. So when you prioritize the discussions that are taking place, this is just my general assessment on the companies I've worked with, the most primary opportunity for social media has always been customer service. And in turn, the most interesting examples for companies using social media have always been driven from customer service, not marketing, not public relations, because they have that infrastructure for response. Then communications, then branding, then marketing. But I can tell you that the lead between customer service and communications is vast. It is huge. And that is because, number one, those are the conversations. People are looking for help and people are looking for direction. And number two, because on the other side, on the outward or outbound model, customer service is prepared to respond. But the point of this is that we're all supposed to work together, and we're a company. We're trying to build some sales and increase our customer base. So this is something that I get deeper in this book that I'm writing, but it's the idea of this. Social media is not unlike any outbound marketing or customer service initiative, right? You're supposed to have some sort of integrated brand, something that everybody can rally behind. Anything that's going to go outward needs to be agreed upon by all of the leads of the organization. So that needs to be defined before you send your first tweet, before you upload your first blog post, because the things that you publish say things about your organization that you may not realize while it's one at a time, maybe not so maybe not too much harm can be done, but when they're collectively assembled, right, and we call it a digital shadow, you can start to see the potential perception or the branding issues or challenges or the anarchy that you might in fact have, right? So I call this multiple personality order. This is the idea. There's actually a couple of different discussions on this. The first discussion is of the company. Who is the company within the specific networks? How is it that they want to be presented? And then have those substructures of the divisions and how those personas need to be embodied and projected. The other one that I do realize, and this is something we can talk about, is that people say or ask, hey, you know, I'm participating on my company's behalf on Twitter, and so do I do this as me, or do I do this as me at company name? What's the protocol for that? Because right now I'm not quite sure what to do. Help. So most of the people that I've interviewed are just themselves, right? Like I would just be me, Brian Solis, working on behalf of certain companies. But it gets kind of awkward. And if you look at the networks or the relationships that you're establishing based on your participation and activity, you're probably forging some relationships that are carried with you professionally. You're also forging relationships that carry with you personally. And maybe those two are going to be at odds. Maybe your professional contacts don't necessarily care that you're having a burrito or working out at Gold's Gym. And maybe your personal contacts don't necessarily care about the fact that you found the latest and greatest Twitter tool for the iPhone or the BlackBerry. But the point is that what we start to see is a segmentation in your following, right? There's an interesting tool out there called Twitter Friends that'll show you at any point in time, based on keywords, who responds to you and who you respond to. And if you use that as a snapshot of any time, let's just say you happen to be talking about the latest Ashton movie, or you happen to be talking about this conference, the people who will respond to you, and you can see this in real time, are different. And that starts to show you that you're building relationships contextually. So what that means is you probably want to establish a separate account for any work that you do on behalf of a company. I'm sure the company would love you for that as well, because the company's biggest fear is that you get too popular on a particular network and then you leave and you take that network with you. But if you're branded as part of the company, like for example, Richard at Dell or Lionel at Dell or Frank Eliason, which is Comcast Cares, those are branded for the company and therefore they don't necessarily leave with you. Now, this is something I borrowed thanks to Google Images. So I couldn't credit it because it wasn't creditable. But this is a typical branding exercise that a lot of companies employ. I added this. Let's see if I have a fancy laser beam. No, doesn't matter. I added this because in the social web, you're actually creating a personality around the brand because you're talking to people, right? You're responding to people. You're tweeting at people. And many times, the people that are representing that company don't necessarily understand, number one, what's that brand personality that they're projecting? Number two, how is their personality contributing to or taking away from the brand's personality? And I say that because let's just take Steve Jobs, for example. If Steve Jobs were to get on Twitter tomorrow, that may or may not surprise you. And his tweets may or may not change your perception about who Steve Jobs is, right? Because there's a mystique to Steve. There's a mystique to Apple. And if he were to start to humanize certain things, it might change your perception. He'd really have to think about what it was that he wanted to project if he were to participate out there. Now let's take the company brand, for example. What if Apple got onto Twitter and started to tweet at people like, no, hey, the iPhone really doesn't suck, and we're looking at other people than AT&T to carry our network service forward. I don't know. The point is that Apple has a mystique as well. It has a brand. You hold it in a certain regard. Apple has worked for years to establish that brand through other tools, just like every other company has done. The minute you take to the social web, you start to either help it or put it into jeopardy. But most companies aren't thinking about it at that level, right? If Jim at Apple was suddenly on Twitter answering your problems, how does Jim affect your view of Apple? Does it make it too human? Is Jim too casual, right? Best Buy just announced the 12th Force. I don't know if you guys have checked it out, but basically they empowered almost everybody in their workforce to take to Twitter and to respond to people who were asking questions about consumer electronics, basically anything that Best Buy could participate in. They didn't think about this. They didn't think about the brand personality in this whole ratio. So if you look at the tweet streams of anybody who's helping on behalf of Best Buy, and I'm not kidding you, you will see some great advice and then some atrocious tweets slamming people personally that are just friends because they're not thinking necessarily about how they are representing the brand, and neither did the company, right? And that's the point. We have to think about this very strategically. So I came up with this thing that I'll be releasing pretty soon. I just have to put it through a couple more iterations and make sure it's not not full of crap. It is called the brand reflection cycle. And it's not unlike this this identity thing that life coaches or other folks run you through that basically try to figure out who do you want to be, who is it that you're striving to be, and what are those attributes that we want to associate ourselves with. And I put it into 8 different processes or methods so that we could think about this. What is that brand going to look like if we're on Twitter? What's that brand going to look like on Facebook? And who are the people that we're going to align with it, and how are they going to enforce those attributes through their activity? And how is it that we're going to even structure their bio or their profile or our profile? Because these are the things that we need to think about. I'll upload this so you guys could download it. I'll put it up on Flickr or something. But the point is that you need to figure these characteristics and attributes out before. And it's not just about who you are today, but who do you want to be as well, because then you can start to perform or upload or share the content that's going to enforce that moving forward. How many people saw 300? All right. So the social web is Sparta, right? And if you are not thinking about this, you're going to get your ass kicked. It's all fun and exciting right now, but eventually this is real work and this is real business, and that excitement is going to subside, and people are really going to start looking for answers and reinforcement of those answers, and hopefully you're going to be the company that can do it strategically, right? Because it's not what you say, it's what they say that counts, and they are saying something, we are saying something all the time. We're taking to these tools, and that's kind of what's powering the social web in general. If you haven't read Andrew Keene's book about the cult of the amateur, I highly suggest you do. Even though he's considered the Antichrist of Silicon Valley, he talks a lot about the notions of what's wrong with wisdoms of the crowd in terms of the psychology of it, because everybody believes they're an expert in many regards, judging by the numbers and the activity of the things that they share. They're justified in thinking that. But here's Trent Reznor, if I may quote the famous philosopher Trent. Idiots rule, right? And he left Twitter a couple of weeks ago citing this as the reason, because he didn't believe that there was such a thing as wisdom of the crowds. Now, I only share that with you because we have to really think about it. This is a case for why this personality and why this behavior is so important, right? And this is a quote from Andrew, is that history has proven that the crowd is not very wise. So, all that means is we have to stop practicing this the wrong way. And just because we have access to these tools doesn't mean that that automatically guarantees that we have something interesting to say, right? I mean, I don't know but if you're amused by this like I am, but there are all these fantastic Twitter strategies out there for you to get more friends and more followers, or even the formula or the science of what it takes to get retweeted. I playfully, and I believe this, if you want to get retweeted, limit your tweets to 120 characters, so that way you leave people the room to include RT space at your name. Brilliant. But there are some real formulas out there that people are introducing that are trying to show you the proof, the ways to get retweeted thousands and thousands of times. But this is my point, is like, that's just, really, this... I'll stop cussing. But the point is that there is no formula for that. You want to get retweeted? Well, say something interesting. Say something that people want to retweet. But that's because we're not thinking about this at that level, right? Here's Pizza Hut. They hired a twin turn to take over their... They hired an intern to lead their Twitter program over the summer. It's a cute idea. I showed this slide at a place where the person who hired the twin turn was present, and they weren't too pleased with it. The The point is this, is that this is how companies are taking this, how they are viewing social media. And this is in the resources they apply to it, to the money they apply to it, to the mind share and the brain trust that they apply to it, is a twin turn, right? And you guys all know about that Habitat issue that happened out of the UK on Twitter. Habitat is a furniture company that was leveraging the trending topics, and at the time there were some pretty interesting trending topics like Iran election, Michael Jackson, and they were using those trending topics to promote their new furniture line in the hopes that it would show up in the trend stream and get people to view it, right? And of course, when people saw that and freaked out and started publishing all these negative things about Habitat, they said, oh man, it's not us, it's our intern. So they had an intern on it that was acting without management or direction, but in charge or empowered to run their Twitter account, right? So even though this is the Affiliate Marketing Summit and we are promoting the ideas of generating traffic and making money, we have to think about how to do this a little bit more, strategically online. And there's fantastic ways to do it. I hosted a really big discussion and debate over the right ways to disclose, especially on Twitter and in the blogosphere. And the FTC is going to have to get involved, unfortunately, in this whole thing, even though they haven't published their guidelines yet, because there is no necessarily clear advantage or motivation to disclose these relationships that you might have with companies or sponsored conversations. But it's not rocket science, right? It's just a very human emotion. And that's why I say once you have empathy, you can understand what it takes to be successful here. Because people are looking for information. People are looking for products to purchase. People are looking for products to recommend or companies to recommend. It's just a matter of inserting yourself the right way, right? So what does your participation say about you right now? This is a tool I ran my Twitter stream through. I've done this for my blog stream. I've done this for my blog comment stream. Anything with a feed or a URL, you could run it through one of these tools. And these are the words that seem to stick with me. Asshole is gone now, though, by the way. Just kidding. But this is the point, is that if you run this through certain companies, you will be amazed by the things that come back. And some of them have been really appalling. And so this is the idea that if you are not participating in a very strategic way, it's very noticeable. And this is why we talk about piecing together everything into one puzzle. You start to see that the collective presence equates to something quite different than you intended. It's always the case. And that's because a lot of people in social media, a lot of companies in social media see it as an entitlement, right? They believe they should be on there because their customers are on there. They feel like they're missing out, or that because they have power, they have access to these tools, therefore they should be on there. But it's actually a privilege. It's a privilege to be able to discover these conversations, these connections, these insights, things that we didn't necessarily have access to before that we do now, right? I mean, the confusion here, or at least the misbelief of social media, is that conversations were invented because of social media, right? But I think we all can attest to the fact that we all talked well before social media, and that we talked to other people, we recommended products, we asked questions well before Facebook and well before Twitter. That's why this is a privilege, because now we have a looking glass into these conversations that matter to our business as it exists, as it's defined, and where it's going to be in terms of direction, right? And it's a commitment. Even though companies are always looking at it as a campaign, right? Like, we need to create the next viral video. We need to get people to retweet us. We need to become a trending topic. And it's not necessarily viewed as, how are we going to be part of this? What are we going to contribute to this dialogue that's going to make people better for it, that are going to make people feel like they are empowered, engaged, inspired because of that interaction, right? A lot of companies also look at this as just simply visibility. If we can get a lot of tweets, if we could get a lot of views, then it's visibility. But it's not necessarily the same thing as presence. And presence is, I think, what we should all strive for in any of this, right? And there's the tenets of community building, which I'm still trying to flesh out. But this was inspired by Tony of Zappos asked me to come out to speak to a group of people as part of the Zappos Insights program. And spending the day with Zappos, I can tell you're going to walk away pretty pumped and looking at things a lot differently. And they like to look at things from aspects of, well, what are your core values? As a company, what are your core values? What do you stand for? And as a person representing that company, what are your core values, right? What is that culture that you represent? What's that culture that you're defining? And what's really interesting, in asking these questions about core values and cultures, most employees don't know the answers to these questions, or they don't care. And that's because they're not pervasive within the organization. So if you're going to be part of any culture, remember, this is about sociology and not technology. If you're going to be part of anything that involves sociology or human behavior, you're going to have some elements or representation of a culture that you're trying to contribute out there, right? Because at the end of the day, if no one can align with you, then you haven't accomplished your work. If you haven't made people care, you haven't accomplished your job, because this is about affinity, right? You always hear these buzzwords like transparency, or being authentic in the social web, as if that's supposed to magically, enrich the engagement out there in the social web. But I think it's more about being believable, right? If I can believe in what you're telling me or what you're sharing with me, or that you genuinely care about solving my issues, then I'm going to believe you. And that means a lot more than just being transparent. This is something that I said at the Zappos thing, but being authentic didn't really mean much, right? Because you can authentically be an asshole, and that's supposed to be okay. So the idea is to just start to uncampaign, unmarket, listen, and figure out how you can respond, what you can contribute out there. Build a map that you can justify as not just as a benchmark, but also as an opportunity for your organization to be more effective, to mean something out there in these communities that are going to continue to evolve and grow with or without you, right? And most importantly, act. Not just act by what you hear, not just act by tweeting back or, publishing content that people need or directing people in certain ways, but act internally as well. Evolve that company so that it's adaptive, so that it actually grows and evolves based on the market conditions. It's not top down anymore. People actually are getting control. And for better or for worse, we have the ability to strategically align ourselves, at least from a perception standpoint, to help companies believe we're on the right track. So, in the end, we earn the relationships, trust, and reputation we deserve. So it's up to you guys to figure out what that looks like. So with that, thank you very much. I think we have maybe a few minutes, so if you have any questions, feel free to ask. I'll stick around for a few minutes. Otherwise, thank you. Yes?
I want to know, like, if you go to Craigslist and you type social media blogs, you see a lot of people looking for interns, people to help on the tweets and stuff. I want to know, what do you think about how this market is going to change? You don't see PRs being hired anymore like this because you have a lot of free tools. Do you see bloggers going to the companies being hired as the new PRs? What do you think is going to happen?
I think companies are going to continue to make mistakes. They're going to keep hiring the wrong people to do this job, this very important job, until they learn the hard way. Now, there's going to be companies that are very savvy and very intelligent and very visionary who are going to hire the right people to do this the right way going forward. I'm working with a couple of companies that are really rethinking everything they've done to date and resetting the entire thing. But those are going to be in the minority. But the minute that those companies start to prove that what they did was right, no matter how difficult and hard it was, it will set the standard for the rest of the industry, and people will learn. People learn from case studies, and they also learn from mistakes.
Any tip for the professionals, for the bloggers who are trying to reach those companies, change approach, or
Yeah, well, gosh, there's a bunch of advice I have. I mean, I dedicate everything I do to trying to help those people. I believe that companies, gosh, what's the easy way to say this? Stop reading. Stop looking at other examples and just start doing, right? Do this on your own. That Conversation Prism is like your MBA, right? Just even if you haven't been tasked with doing this for a particular company, go do it for a company and present them with that data. They will be floored by the information that you find. They would never have known it otherwise. Even if they're already listening on Twitter, for example, you will come up with things that'll blow them away. And so you have to give a little bit to get something. You have to give or show or invest to get people to see things your way. Unfortunately, most people aren't doing that. They're using automated tools, and they're just presenting the same ideas, and it's becoming pretty diluted. Companies aren't quite sure who the real experts are. You're welcome. Any other questions?
Right, this is PR and everyone's looking at the external. Have you come across any corporations that are using social media for internal communication?
Yeah, actually a lot. Best Buy was well lauded when they introduced the Blue Shirt Network. The Blue Shirt Network was something that was started by two guys internally that basically created an infrastructure to help people communicate, to answer questions. You know, everything related to benefits, HR, to programs, contests, competitions, status, store openings. And almost immediately it took off within, and it actually had to become an official Best Buy program. But, you know, Web 2 only simplified the ability to create sort of internal communications. There's always been the intranet, and it's just, I think its effect and its lack of great examples stems from the inability to answer the culture question or the core value question. I don't think people feel personally compelled to interact much more than they have to, because in many cases it's just a job. But in Best Buy's case, they have a real great culture internally. There's other examples too, and I have a whole page of them. I should be able to cite this off the top of my head. IBM's another one, HP, but really the only one that shows really great human uptake is the Best Buy example. Any other questions? Yes?
Okay, I see a few examples of companies that spend a lot of money on social media, actually spending it just as a way to push content.
Yes.
Not to have a dialogue. And is that just the first generation of marketers taking it seriously, or is it just a lot of bad vendors who just sell what's easy to sell? Yeah,
well, there's a lot of companies that are using social media to broadcast content. And some of them are doing it in different ways. I used to think, you know, a few years ago when really this started to blow up, that companies that were broadcasting content were, you know, they were not genuinely participating or engaging. And then I realized that if you look at the technographics or the 99-1 rule, most people are consuming content. So as long as that content is being published in a way that's useful and helpful and not, say, sales or marketing or, you know, the typical hyperbole, that it was really interesting stuff, that actually there was a benefit to it that we just didn't realize because it was using a social channel as a broadcast channel. But look at Obama, right? When Obama was elected, his people were interviewed as being social media gurus and visionaries for using social media to get him or to contribute to his election victory. When if you look at everything, and I wrote about this, it was a broadcast channel, and it was even worse. It was a sales channel to get money, to get donations, to get contributions. And so it wasn't part of the conversation at all, but no one noticed that. No one noticed that because they felt privileged or honored just to actually see updates coming from him. And it worked. So my answer is if you're broadcasting the right information the right way at the right, you know, cadence, that it works. It does work.
But do you need to be ready to respond when that 1%?
I don't think so.
No?
I think you should have a response strategy. You should always have a crisis communication strategy for any company. It's not going to be Twitter, but I'm going to give you two examples. One was Domino's, right? Everybody saw that Domino's video, or hopefully you didn't see that Domino's video. The Domino's video, Domino's as a company and their crisis communications department dealt with that really amazingly, right? When that video hit, that blog that broke that video, you know, they were contacted. They said, thank you for sharing this. We've contacted the authorities. We're looking for insider, you know, for help to help us figure out who these people are. They found them, and all these updates on the original blog about how Domino's was trying to fix this. But then somebody within the organization must have told them to get on Twitter and to get on YouTube because suddenly they were out there. Oh, you know, blah, 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 blah. Then there was a CEO video that was just absolutely horrendous. And it started to make it look worse than it needed to be, right? They were already done with it. So a negative instance didn't necessarily need social media to fix it, right? And in fact, in that case, I think social media made it worse. And there's maybe we should turn off the cameras for this. Then there's the Motrin Moms situation which everybody points to as why your company needs to be ready to participate in social media, why your company needs to respond in times of crisis. Yet the numbers that I have seen based on that data show that Motrin sales have been up consistently since then, right? And so that starts to lend back to that old adage of there is no such thing as bad press, right? Even though you would swear that all of those conversations, you know, that Motrin was going to go out of business. Should they have had a response strategy? Absolutely. Should they have been listening and responded a lot sooner? Sure, absolutely. How did it fare in the long term? I don't know that there's any concrete evidence in either direction yet. But the point is that listening and responding should be done very carefully, with the best of intentions, and even sometimes practicing restraint in terms of responding until that is defined is probably the best way to go. But definitely listening could only help. Yes?
Right. You ever found that the comments were kind of skewed? Because usually the top 1% are most vocal and the most annoying, rather than, people who love the service.
Yeah, absolutely. But companies respond as if it is representative of the entire marketplace, and I think that that's a mistake. And that's why I track sentiment across the greater population to see if that is indeed. I have that data. Should something erupt and that 1% start to contribute a whole bunch of stuff that's not corresponding to the data I already have that shows trending over time, then I know that I could potentially just leave it alone, or it tells me how I should respond. But doing this stuff always prepares you for what to do in the future, now and in the future. Absolutely. All right. Well, I will see you guys in the Blogger Lounge. Thank you.